Hi, so that this week is about the let's see, chapter 30 in the 295 class. And this is about when everything shifts over to the United States, to America. A long time ago, I used to think that there weren't any significant American artists, but once I started working on my degrees, I found that there was amazing people that I was not appreciating because I was so focused on the European and what was going on there. We've had a shift from not in this class, but before the survey class that I used to teach goes from the prehistoric to all the way to the current times. So what you're not studying in this class is the beginning, which is basically the Middle East with prehistoric, and then it shifted to focusing on Greece, and then from Greece it went to Italy. These are where the major movements in your textbook would be if you were taking the survey course. Italy goes to, in the Renaissance, then goes to Paris, to France, and some of the what they call the Low Countries, even though they're on the kind of the top of Europe, but it's because they're flat and they're lower, less mountainous, like in Holland and Denmark. So that's where we came from, is from last week with the Surrealists, with the Dadaists, and all that stuff that just smashed all rules. And didn't begin the modern period, because we started the modern period in the 1850s, 60s. And so this is where we shipped to New York. Everything literally came to New York. Part of it was because of World War II. Many of the artists, the Surrealists came here, lived here. The Dadaists, one or two of them, Marcel Duchamp was one of them, and he was French, and so you saw his work last week. So this is a shift between the power and the people who dominated the art world and what was going on and what was being shown, etc., and United States. So before, let's see, right before, so Picasso was around 1910, and then we had World War I, and then II. Artists were creating. Once the World War II and World War I pretty much decimated to a great degree, and a lot of death in the whole continent, and especially, but then also death in other extended areas like Africa. So the New York artists, because anyway, that's part of why it shifted to the United States. So, and more freedom to express yourself. The first part of the chapter is we're going to be talking about regionalism, which means for American art, it means loosely what region you're from. When we look at Frida Kahlo, it's Mexico. Georgia O'Keeffe, West Coast or East Coast, sorry. And let's see, and a lot of them are definitely from New York, straight on the East Coast. Grant Wood, Midwest. So he's offered that really great Midwest flavor, and you see it on page 943 with Grant Wood. If you're taking the Pierce College class, it's a different part of the book anyway. So all these artists, and then also we cover this week the emerging art from that started in New York, kind of, although there were some American artists who were in France, particularly artists of color. So they were not subjected to the issues here at that time. And so they had more freedom to move around and to create and be recognized. Many of them moved back here and started working here also. Jacob Lawrence was not one of those. I think he spent a little bit of time in Europe, but there were others who were over there and then came back. So, and then I mentioned Frida Kahlo. So the book starts out with kind kind of starts out with, no matter what class you're in, is one of the great American painters who I came to just love so much, and I think all of you guys would appreciate it. The Edward Hopper. He was a really unique, as actually most of these people were in the United States. He was first living in New York. He did some really amazing, let me share the screen here. Really amazing work with that had to do with, I'll use the word solitude, not loneliness necessarily, but solitude. A lot of his work was done during the 40s and then after the war. And so the very famous one, oops, in there, great. Let's see. So this is an article I want you all to read called "We Are All Edward Hopper Paintings," and this has to do with the. Here we go. The it says, "Is he the artist of the coronavirus age?" Not that that was going on during that time, but they're talking here in a really great article about deserted cityscapes, which we experienced in the first year, basically. And possibly part of the second year of isolation in cities around the world, and isolated figures. So it was a great article because it sort of conflated those two and merged them into one concept, talking about the earlier painters and how they were actually sort of speaking to this concept. Part of why it was happening with Hopper is because of the war. Let's see if they have this one. This is in the book also, both books. It's called Nighthawks, and this was done right smack in the middle of the war, right after America got into it. So this has to do with the emptiness of mainly, it's a symbol of mainly of the emptiness of, he's showing the streets, and even the building behind this looks dark and deserted. But it basically is talking about how many of the American men, which was a big part of the population, were in Europe fighting a war. And so it was very obvious to, in America during that time, I've heard stories from the generation before me, how weird it was to not have, like in small towns, hardly any of the men were there. And so he's sort of talking about that. Also, possibly the idea of isolation, where we didn't want to get into the war. FDR really fought it because he knew the voters weren't for it. But after Pearl Harbor, that sort of was the end of that. Everybody wanted to take care of that. So it says here, a lonely shop worker, people sitting far apart at tables for one in a diner. Hard to tell if there is serious comment or a glib joke with a side order of self-pity within these people. A lot of the workers, the females, were out of the home now because they were working in factories for the war effort. So this is about his work, and I wanted you to see some of these, more of these. It's in this, and I believe, and it's also in the little bit in the PDF that I have of regionalism. So I would say this is not about forced isolation, it's about voluntary living alone and chosen, what they say here, chosen and contented solitude. These people don't look upset or discontented. You can see, looking out a window, a lot of his early paintings were about windows. This is a reference to Munch, which you studied the week before last. Again, isolation. Now, Norway, and I've been there, is unusual. It's like Alaska and the upper latitude countries where during the winter, you only have about 4 or 5 hours of light. In the summer, it's completely changed. So in the winter, you'd have very little light, and then all of a sudden it was gone, and it was night during the day. It's really strange. And then in summer, it is light all day, and then around 11 o'clock, midnight, you start seeing dusk, and then it turns into, it stays that way for about an hour, and then it's dark. or I'm sorry, it gets dark for about an hour and then it gets light again. It's very strange. People have to do their blinds, although when I was there, everybody there was certainly used to it. We weren't. So this is a Norwegian painter. So he's talking about that. He was also a very depressed man, so part of that. So here's, that's just one evidence of that. I'm going to go right into this. I'm also going to keep referring back to, these are my notes when I used to teach in the classroom and write on the whiteboard. So American scene painting, Midwest 30s, 40s, rejection of the modernist movement. So they were saying, we want to paint real life, similar to Courbet, who you studied in the very beginning of the course, rejecting that, the modernists that were coming through, like around the Impressionists. So rejection of that. At this point, it was more the emerging cubism that's what I would call not just modernist, but abstract. So some of that work, many people have trouble relating to, tolerating, understanding, but this would be like a rejection of that, which was Picasso was doing that. And then you have, of course, the Surrealists and the Dadaists who are just, breaking all kinds of rules. So the modernist movement, the regionalists were sort of talking about, we want to get back to, and it says here, the historical roots in American art. A lot of it looked like some of the colonial art that was very simplistic, and they wanted to get back to that. But they're incredibly beautiful, rich paintings that spoke to their time and their place, which I believe when I teach, every single period has their own type of artwork. Like during the war, you saw very different, and expresses what was going on during that time. Let's see, farm landscapes, history of the towns or regions, indigenous work, beginning. They sought to form a school of art, and so we do call it regionalism, and it's focused on American history and concerns. The WPA, Works Progress Administration, was a huge deal. FDR started this around the 30s and 40s especially, and so a lot of these artists, he believed, and this has never happened since, unfortunately, that the government should help, since they were in the war effort and spending money on that. People were suffering because, not that we had been attacked here, that wasn't going on, of course, but the people were suffering. They had to ration. Nobody was eating very much. So, except possibly the people in the Midwest, but they still had to donate, goods and send over to Europe. So this was a government institution that paid artists, and you had to be vetted, you had to show your work, and they would choose who would do that. And it was all over the map. There were abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock, and this is what allowed these people to continue painting. They were on government sites, many post offices and other institutions like universities, federal buildings were had murals painted by these people. And it's not like Jackson Pollock was doing his abstract painting on those, but it allowed them, and I've read the details of what they got per week, and it was to live on, and it just made a huge difference. Otherwise, we would have suffered having like no art that was significant during that time. And it talks about here. There were two camps you can split. There was the regionalism, which I was just talking about, and the New York. And the New York artists like Pollock were supported also by wealthy regionalists, mostly supported by the government. Supported by the wealthy, regionalists mostly supported by the government. So the main two were Jackson Pollock, and Thomas Hart Benton, which I know you'll love their work. Let's see. And they began being overlooked when the modernists started taking over. And they also, I guess, they were made fun of. I've read a lot of conversations in books talking about that, about sort of ridiculing that you guys aren't serious artists, you're not doing serious work. And that's sort of stopped after a while, and everybody was, I forgot a T in there. Okay. This was Benton mural, and I'll wait until we get to that part here. Look at regionalism. I think I opened it up already. Let's see where it is. Maybe not. Okay. Oh, I didn't open it up. It's down here. Sorry. Let's try again. There it is. So this is just a brief one showing, and it talks about American and Latin, but there'll be others I'll show you from about Frida Kahlo. This is, I mean, you can tell this is kind of an odd composition, but this is a really good typical. This is Grant Wood, who did the American Gothic that you'll see. It's really odd because the point of view here is from the top of a hill, and that was kind of unusual. Normally you'd be down here and you know, paint a picture of the church and the barn and the farm. He had this really distinctive style, as did Thomas Hart Benton, with curvature of and movement. And it almost looks like, you know, this is a depiction of movement also. Georgia O'Keeffe, let's go through here. Okay. Georgia O'Keeffe is the next most important one, and they start that they have one of her cityscapes paintings in the beginning of the book. She was also unusual. She started out just doing drawings. One of her friends sent it to New York and gave it to Albert Stieglitz, which you read about last week about photography, the beginning of photography. He became, he pushed a chemical process of photography into artwork, and it was sort of controversial at the beginning. Anyway, meanwhile, he at some point he became very famous. He was doing really well, and he started a studio that where he showed all kinds of artwork, sculptures, and he was even getting things, some of the first Picasso, as far as I read, and showing it in New York. Her work was abstract, which she would take as flowers. Her first ones are drawings of seeds and pods from, she used to teach in Texas for a brief time. She'd go out in the prairies and just draw what would be like a magnified, so you couldn't really tell what it was, but she was fascinated with the shapes. Here's a really good example of one. She's known for very beautiful colors, a lot of pastels, and the older she got, this one is about the most realistic one that she's done. People just love these. Jack in the Pulpit, another flower. She's showing this intense black as you look inside of the flower, which most people don't. This is one of her signature paintings. At some point she moved from New York. She and Stieglitz were lovers and married for a while. So you've got two major artists. He had a problem with adultery, and so she kind of got fed up with that after years. They remained friends the rest of their lives, but he was also older than her. So she moved down to New Mexico, and there was a huge population of pretty significant artists and writers. D.H. Lawrence was down there for a while. And she started falling in love with the hills, the mountains, and they're simplistic again. She did a lot of these skulls, and a lot of people, the critics, tried to say this was about death, and she absolutely denied that. This is not about death. In fact, she felt it simply came from her walking these hills and a lot of desert dust, and she would pick up these. She thought they were really fascinating to draw. She did drawings first. So that's what it's pretty much. She says things like it's more simple, you're trying to make it complicated. Another one, she did this kind of white on white with a black stripe. And here's Hopper again, another self-portrait. All artists do that. All artists should. I've done it myself. It's not a pleasant process because it's always surprising that you see what you actually look like, and it surprises most. This is called the Long Lake. So he goes from New York up to, I believe it was Maine, and he lived up there the rest of his life. It's a different kind of solitude. Now you're out in the open, like his boat. You can't see anybody in it, and everything looks deserted. Like, does anybody live in that house? There's the one we just looked at. Some people here. I'm always impressed. People talk about how he uses white and the light, brilliant light hitting that side of the house, and then the shadow. Notice here, shadows are blue. They're not, because they don't, nothing looks black. Shadow is never black. It's a mix of colors. Another one of his New York ones. Another one, almost like voyeurism. You're watching somebody from another building. Here's another one. It looks like a bank or something, and yet it looks pretty deserted. You can see a few blurry people in the background. Here's a great one. Like these old, I just love these old, small town, long road, no town near it probably, and basically a gas station. This is Grant Wood. He kind of does here pixelated. You saw in Georges Seurat, one of the post-impressionists, just painting with dots, but he's definitely showing. This is the Midwest, probably Indiana, something like that. This is great. This shows storm coming in. This is very Midwestern. I've heard from people in the Midwest, you can smell a storm coming. It's got a particular smell in the air. Here's the richness of the soil at that point, and just doing normal things, hanging out your laundry and mowing the grass. Here's his most famous one. This one's almost as famous and identifies an artist like Munch's The Scream. I mean, almost everybody knows or has seen this painting. Here he's using, critics go over this thing and show the use of line, and there's, vertical and horizontal, and he repeats them. So this vertical, the tines on this fork, and stripes here, he repeats these here. I think it's because there's a sense of rationality or reason, or to keep a structure looking and repeating that, a sense of almost strength, structure, and solidity. Very stern people. If you've ever been to the Midwest, or Montana has the same kind of thing. People don't talk a lot, and these are hardworking people, and it's amazing. This guy has a really pretty nice jacket on, but most people always have a suit for church. Here's Benton. Now, he was the precursor and the teacher and mentor of Jackson Pollock. He was a young man. He started working with Benton, who was already pretty well known. And here's what I was talking about, this curvy sort of composition that he does. The waves here don't look liquid, they look solid. So it's just a really different look. This one, I'm not going to read this. You can read this. I'm going to explain this. The Parks, Circus, and the Klan and the Press. He was not known for anything political, but this is during 1933. This is the rise of the Nazi Party in Europe, which all Americans were very aware of. It was in the papers. And the Depression, and also the Klan. He lived in Indiana, and I did not realize how big that organization was there. So he's showing American life. He's got the evidence here of the war, and he's talking about World War with the planes. They were not World War I planes, but World War II. But he was pretty aware of that too. Whoops. Coming to the fore. So we have normal scenes: fighting a fire, the firefighters, the press. Here's the press, typewriter, printing. This little part here shows, and they're showing here the kind of curvature. He's still getting that sort of line, and I'm also sort of showing what's on this side, what's on this side. This here shows a hospital. This was a still deeply divided, almost like the South, as far as blacks and whites. And he's showing a hospital with a white child and a black child next to each other, which probably wouldn't have been happening at the time. Here's just planting things in the earth. The really popular thing coming to town was circuses. And here's the Klan. And he really wanted to make a statement about that. So it was very unusual, but very Benton. And here's just a couple more oil towns, boomtown. They're the kind of composition here, equating it to El Greco. I think in one of the PowerPoints about Picasso, they were showing the influence of El Greco also. Here's another one. There's just different. It's not a typical landscape, but Curry was also very popular. He still is. It has a sense of movement and intensity that normal landscapes, traditional ones, are very placid and serene. And he's showing something different, like a horse out of control, the storm and the bending of the trees, and they come over here. So circus, taken from a really odd angle, but showing movement. Another one that shows the reality of a storm in the Midwest. I love the way he does this, the cloud, the oncoming rain. And studying white, this is typical of American artists who studied in Europe and studied with Impressionist painters. This is very impressionistic looking, and that's how you learn how to paint. Diego Rivera, we'll look at a little bit more. He was the husband on and off of Frida Kahlo. And he was living in Mexico City, as was she. And Mexico City, there was a big communist movement there because of the aristocrats who were, there was this imbalance of class and wealth. And he was very much communist, thinking that, that meant that everybody would share land and stuff, which of course didn't happen. But this is just a gorgeous painting. It's so symmetrical too, either side and line down the middle, this. But this is the kinds of things he did. He did murals. This is one. He started getting commissions in the United States, which was also kind of odd but he was becoming so famous that people were really intrigued with his work. Now, this is in Detroit, and it's called Detroit Industry. That's where, the cars were made. It's a fresco. If you take the art survey course, you'll learn about how frescoes are done. They embed into, you prepare the wall, and then once it's half dried, then you start painting on it, and it just seeps right into the wall. So they're very permanent. He also put in his own Mexican symbols, because that's what he did. It was important to him. And then the signs of up close of labor, which is appropriate for a city like Detroit, that were the assembly lines were now going strong, and a lot of production. So here's looks like motors, engines. This is the odd couple, Diego and Frida Kahlo. He was older than her. And by the way, starting around the time of Picasso and then further, there started to become couples who became famous and were working together. And so you see a lot of that, and you'll see a lot of it further, not so much today, but for some reason during this, like, I don't know, 30, 40-year period. So they met, and she was doing her thing. This is her show, or her painting. She was in, they came to the United States. They went to New York. They did some work in California. He did, and because he was doing murals. He did one in New York for the Rockefeller family, who owns what we call 30 Rock, the Rockefeller building. And it's where the ice skating rink is and everything. You've seen it in movies. And she was here with Diego for, a while, but she had nothing to do, and it was hard for her to paint. People were not giving her much attention. He was like the big star. So and this is self-portrait on the border between Mexico and the United States. And what she's doing is just really poignant. She's showing on the left her culture. So it's a painting of two different cultures. She loved the United States. She particularly loved New York. So she was really impressed. She met so many artists, including surrealists who had, like I said, moved here. But this is Mexico. This is the symbols of that. Very symbolic stuff in here. She was really into that. You remember the Day of the Dead. They celebrate death to honor life. You've got roots here. She's showing she's rooted in that country. And then here she's showing the industry. She's over here. It says FORD. There's a factory, Ford factory, and the flag. Here she is with another, what some people call surrealist. She denied that she was a surrealist. She was just a unique painter. But there's a lot of symbology. I mean, the crown of thorns, for instance. She also was very damaged in a accident where she was thrown off a car or a like a, not a bus, but a tram almost in Mexico City when she was 18. Went right through her spine. She survived it. She was in traction and a cast full body for about a year. And then her parents bought her some paints, and that's when she started painting. She's always painted what she considers a truth, her truth. This is the two types of Fridas, which she felt like she was both. A lot of times she wore traditional Mexican clothing, almost peasant-like, because she identified as a communist with the people. They're pretty intense. I mean, here they're sharing the heart, obviously. This one's a little bit damaged, and it shows here symbols of miscarriages. She wanted children and she couldn't have any. Okay, so that's regionalism. I'm going to show you one video of Frida. It's really cool, and I won't show you the whole thing, but kind of shows part of her life. Oops. Start again. I think I clicked too fast. There we go. Some of the things that she said in her lifetime, people in those days journaled and wrote a lot of letters. There she is as a child. I think she already looked pretty intense. That's the home they built, called the Blue House, still there. Studio. They attracted a lot of writers and a lot of artists to Mexico City, who would come down and stay with them. She wore very bright clothes, which is typical of Mexican culture at that time and still is. The father was a photographer. She was painting in her studio. So you can see with some of this paintings that may be not in this textbook, in other words. Another artist, writer. She was a photographer. Diego, pain, life, happiness. They were very, what you would call today, codependent. I think is a good name for them. They were very intense, very much in love, had a lot of fights. And eventually, because he was also coming into a lot, she finally divorced him, and then they remarried a couple years later. It's the house. Lenin, so he was there too. So there was a very big communist element with them. Stalin. And to my mind, they were pretty naive about what communism actually was. Yeah, I'm gonna go forward here. It shows her, she was in pain because of that accident. It never got better, never got healed. While she had to go back into traction. And she endured a lot of pain in her back from walking. So it's amazing she was able to do the work that she did for as long as she did. But she did die young. I think she was barely 50. And then back to the course. Okay, and then the next one is a really cool video of George O'Keeffe. This is when she's very old. It's kind of grainy, but I just love it. There's 3 parts, and I don't know which part this is, but she's talking about her work. She's pretty feisty woman. She lived till she was 100, and painted almost to the end. Again. This is an hour long, so I'll just
This
show you some of
program
it.
is made possible by grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and Xerox Corporation. It's as if my mind.
Okay, let's show this. And there's when you saw PDF.
The first year I was out here, because there were no flowers, I began picking up blooms. Well, I wanted to take something home. I wanted to take something home to work on. I had a whole pile in the patio there. I wasn't painting them right then. I had to get them first.
So this is what I was talking about earlier. This is her first years in Mexico, went out by herself with a Model A car, and she painted all day in that heat. She painted outside. Sometimes she said she had to go under the car because it was so hot. But she was pretty fierce about her work. So this is a funny scene here. She's talking about men.
Talking about the great American novel, the great American play, the great American, it was the great American everything. And I thought they didn't know anything about America. A lot of them had never been across the Hudson. So I thought I'll make my picture a red, white, and blue. I'll make it an American painting for these people that don't go across the Hudson. And this was my painting. I put a red stripe down either side.
Okay.
Entertained me, but I don't think anybody else caught on to it for quite a while.
Okay, I need to stop and go back.
Another thing I collected was artificial flowers that they had in all the little country stores. Poor artificial flowers, but sometimes they were very pretty. The bones do not symbolize death to me. They are shapes that I enjoy. It never occurs to me that they have anything to do with death. They are very lively.
No, George O'Keeffe denies that it has anything to do with death. She does not associate it with death. For instance, that pelvis series of the bones she found on the desert, she holds them up and then sees the mountain through the hole in the bone, so that she goes through this into nature. You can take it as a symbol of a sort of concrete immortality in these things too, that they outlast.
Entertained me, but I don't think anybody else caught on to it for quite a while. They pleased me. And I have enjoyed them very much in relation to the sky. Artificial flowers that they had in all the little country stores.
Okay, I'm sorry, this